I found it in a basement in Dresden, a fragment of copper plate that didn't belong to the house or the era. It was a schematic, or so I thought, until the load distribution math failed to align with any known architectural standard of the 19th century. We are told that bells are instruments of faith. We are told they are tools of timekeeping, rhythmic markers for a pious peasantry. But look closer at the metallurgy. Look at the alloys. The official record insists on a mixture of copper and tin, a standard bronze intended for resonance. Yet, when you subject these relics to spectrographic analysis, you find traces of iridium, you find antimony, you find elements that serve no purpose in the pursuit of a clear C sharp. Ask yourself why a cathedral requires a resonant frequency that vibrates the very bedrock. Ask yourself why the towers were built with iron ley lines before the advent of the modern electrical grid. It was not music, it was not prayer, it was something else. A grander mechanism hidden in plain sight, silenced by a history rewritten by the victors of a forgotten transition. The pattern began to emerge not in the grand cathedrals of Europe, but in the ruins of the American West. San Francisco, before the fires of 1906, possessed a skyline that defied its supposed frontier origins. Huge, bulbous domes, spires topped with intricate, non-functional filigree, and the bells, always the bells. We are led to believe that a group of gold miners and pioneers hauled thousands of tons of masonry across a wilderness to build structures they didn't have the tools to design. It is a narrative of convenience. What if the buildings were already there? What if the pioneers were merely the inheritors of a scorched earth? Consider the star forts. We are told they are defensive fortifications designed to deflect cannon fire. Yet, from an aerial perspective, their geometry is undeniably fractal. They are not shields, they are conductors. They are the base plates for a global energy system that used the atmosphere itself as a medium, not a wire in sight, not a coal plant to be found, just the hum of the air and the vibration of the bells. Institutional gatekeeping is a subtle art. It doesn't always involve burning books. Sometimes it simply involves changing the captions. In the archives of the Smithsonian, there are photographs of the great exhibitions, the World's Fairs of the late 1800s. These white cities were supposedly built of plaster and wood, intended to be demolished after 6 months. Look at the scale. Look at the Romanesque arches and the massive lagoons. Does it seem logical to build a marble empire for a temporary party? Or was the temporary label a legal fiction used to justify the demolition of a pre-existing infrastructure? They called it the Gilded Age, a term that implies a thin layer of gold over something base. I suspect the reverse. It was a thin layer of lies over a golden age of free energy. The bells were the keys. When the bells rang in a synchronized frequency across a starfort network, they didn't just call people to service, they ionized the air. They provided the etheric charge that lit the mercury vapor lamps of the old world. But why erase it? Why tear down the most efficient power grid in human history and replace it with miles of copper wire and meters that charge you by the kilowatt? Control is the only currency that matters to the architects of the modern era. You cannot tax the air. You cannot put a meter on a vibration. To transition humanity into a state of dependency, the old tech had to be rebranded as superstition and its hardware destroyed. The great fires of the 19th century were not accidents. London, Chicago, Moscow, San Francisco. The narrative is always the same. A cow kicks a lantern, a candle falls, and suddenly the most sophisticated stone masonry on earth is reduced to rubble. It is the erasure trope in its most violent form. They burned the evidence of our autonomy. They melted the bells. They silenced the resonance. And in the silence, they built a world where energy is a commodity and history is a script written by those who own the wires. The metallurgy is the smoking gun. If you examine the great bell of Moscow, the Tsar Kolokol, you are told it cracked because of uneven cooling during a fire, a convenient story. But look at the sheer mass, over 200 tons of metal. To cast such an object requires a furnace capacity that, according to the official timeline, did not exist in 1735. Not in Russia, not anywhere, unless the technology of the time was not what we are told. What if the bell wasn't meant to ring? What if it was a capacitor? The shape is not accidental. The parabolic curve of a heavy bell is the ideal geometry for focusing acoustic energy into a singular point. If you place a bell of that magnitude at the center of a star fort, at the convergence of subterranean water veins, you aren't making a musical instrument. You are making a seismic resonator. You are tapping into the heartbeat of the planet itself. Not magic, not myth. Physics. We see the remnants of this global network in the orphans of history, the foundling hospitals, the massive influx of repopulation events following the mid-19th century. Why were there so many children without parents? Why were orphan trains crisscrossing continents? What if the mud flood or the Great Reset wasn't a single event, but a series of systematic purges designed to clear the board? The new generation was raised in institutions where the old world was presented as a fantasy or a dark age of ignorance. They were taught that the massive stone ruins around them were the work of primitive ancestors who spent decades carving granite for no reason other than vanity. They were taught to ignore the bells. They were taught that the hum in the air was just the wind. But the body remembers what the mind is told to forget. We still feel a strange, ancestral pull toward those old frequencies. We still feel the tension in the air before a storm. The same tension the bells were designed to harvest. Ask yourself why the grand Tartary of the maps disappeared. In the 18th century, Tartaria was labelled as the largest empire on earth, stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific. By the 20th century, it was a footnote, a geographic term. How do you lose a continent-spanning civilization? You do it through the schools, you do it through the encyclopedias, and you do it by destroying their power source. The Tartarian bells were not just in the east, the network was global. The architecture is identical from St. Petersburg to Salt Lake City. The same red brick, the same arched windows, the same bell towers that now stand empty or house silent iron replacements. The original bells were tuned to the Schumann resonance, the natural frequency of the Earth's electromagnetic field. When they rang, they didn't just sound, they stabilized, they healed, they powered. There is a somber reality to the way we live now, huddled under the flicker of fluorescent lights, paying for the privilege of existing in a depleted environment. We are told this is progress. We are told that the Industrial Revolution was a leap forward from the darkness. But when I look at the old schematics, I don't see darkness. I see a luminous civilization that understood the relationship between sound, geometry, and the ether. I see a world where the bells were the lungs of the city, breathing in the static charge of the atmosphere and exhaling light. The erasure was so complete that we now mock the very idea of it. We call it conspiracy. We call it pseudoscience. But science is a process of observation, and what I observe are buildings that have no chimneys, towers that have no purpose, and a history that has no consistency. Consider the load distribution of a typical 19th century cathedral. The weight is centred on the four pillars of the nave, but the spire, the highest point, is often hollow, capped with a metal finial that resembles an antenna. If the purpose was purely aesthetic, why use conductive materials? Why connect that finial to the bell frame with heavy copper strapping? The lightning rod is the official explanation, a device meant to ground energy. But what if it was meant to collect it? What if the cathedral was a power station and the congregation was a biological component of the circuit? Human bodies are conductive, thousands of people singing in unison at a specific frequency, housed within a resonant stone chamber beneath a vibrating bell. It is a biological battery, not faith, not religion. Something else. An integrated system of energy production that used the very essence of human vitality to spark the grid. The silence that followed the silencing of the bells is the defining characteristic of our age. We live in a muted world. The white noise of our technology, the buzz of the transformer, the drone of the engine, is a dissonant frequency. It breaks the spirit, it causes fatigue, it keeps us in a state of low-level anxiety. Contrast this with the world of the resonance, where the background hum of the city was a perfect harmonic of the earth itself. We have been unplugged from the source and plugged into a synthetic substitute. We are the inheritors of a ghost system, living in the hollowed-out shells of a Titan civilization, wondering why the world feels so thin. The evidence is there, hidden in the copper, buried in the archives, and ringing in the quiet moments when the wind catches an old tower. Ask yourself, if the bells were just for music, why did they have to kill the people who knew how to tune them? The transition from the atmospheric energy of the old world to the combustion-based economy of the new was not a gradual evolution of thought, but a violent pivot of necessity. If you look at the census data from the late 1800s, there is a statistical anomaly that no historian has been able to reconcile. The sudden disappearance of entire demographics in the wake of the so-called industrial boom. Where did they go? Or, more importantly, who replaced them? We see the photographs of the great cities, empty. Broad avenues in Washington, D.C., Paris, and Berlin, devoid of life. Even though the architecture is complete. No horses, no people, just the long, stretching shadows of the afternoon sun hitting silent towers. The official narrative says the exposure times of early cameras were too slow to capture moving figures, a convenient technicality, but look at the sharpness of the mud in the streets, look at the clarity of the stagnant water. If the camera could capture a puddle, it could capture a crowd. The truth is more unsettling. The cities were empty because they had been harvested. The Bell network had been weaponized or deactivated, and the population that understood its use was removed. What if the Great Reset is not a future threat, but a historical recurring event? The bells were the stabilizers, the anchors of a reality that functioned on a higher frequency. When those anchors were cut, the social fabric dissolved. This is where the concept of the mud flood moves from internet fringe theory into the realm of architectural forensic evidence. Walk through any major city built before 1900. Look at the ground floor windows. They are half buried, sliced in two by the pavement. We are told this is architectural style or settling. Ask yourself, would a master stonemason, capable of carving intricate marble friezes, waste time and material building full-size windows that face directly into the dirt? Of course not. The ground we walk on is not the original ground. A layer of sediment, several feet thick, was deposited across the globe in a single geological heartbeat. This was the moment the resonance failed. This was the moment the bells stopped ringing. The atmospheric moisture, no longer held in check by the vibrational field of the star forts, collapsed. Not a flood of water, but a flood of liquefied earth. The institutions that rose from the mud are the ones that currently dictate our reality. They claimed the buildings. They renamed the history. They took the technology and hid it behind the veil of occultism. The very word occult simply means hidden. What they hid was the physics of the bell. In the basement of the Vatican, in the vaults of the British Museum, there are copper plates that explain the science of cymatics, the study of visible sound. If you place sand on a metal plate and vibrate it with a specific frequency, the sand forms perfect geometric patterns. These patterns are identical to the floor plans of the star forts. They are identical to the rose windows of the cathedrals. The buildings were the physical manifestation of a frequency. They were frozen music, as the old saying goes, but they were also functional resonators. When the frequency was changed, the structure of the world changed with it. Not just the buildings, but the people. We became denser, slower, more susceptible to the gravity of the new masters. The institutional erasure of Tartaria was the final step in the consolidation of power. If people knew that free, wireless energy was once a global standard, they would never have accepted the power lines that now crisscross our skies like a cage. They had to make the past look miserable. They had to invent the Middle Ages. They had to portray the 19th century as a time of filth and horse manure to distract from the fact that those people were living in marble palaces with atmospheric lighting. Look at the street lamps in photos from 1850. There are no wires. There is no gas infrastructure, just a glowing bulb atop a metal pole. Self-igniting gas, the historians claim. Or was it a mercury vapor discharge lamp and excited by the ambient frequency of the bells? The metallurgy of the lamp posts matches the metallurgy of the bells. It was a closed circuit, a symphony of light and sound that cost nothing but the will to maintain the resonance. But maintenance requires knowledge, and knowledge requires a lineage. The lineage was broken during the period of the orphan trains. Thousands of children, stripped of their heritage, were sent to the outskirts of the empire to start fresh. They were the blank slates upon which the new history was written. They were told that the bells were for the glory of God, a vague, unreachable concept, rather than the utility of man. They were taught to see the spires as symbols of religious aspiration rather than functional antennas. The institutional gatekeepers became the priests of a new science, one that prioritized scarcity over abundance. They took the iridium, they took the antimony, and they left us with lead and iron. They left us with a world that grinds and rattles instead of a world that hums. Is it possible to restart the resonance? There are reports from urban explorers who have climbed into the forbidden steeples of abandoned cathedrals. They talk about a feeling of intense vibration, a static charge that makes the hair on their arms stand up. They talk about the dead bells, relics that have been silenced with wooden blocks or lead weights. Why muffle a bell that hasn't been rung in a century? Because as long as the metal exists, as long as the geometry is intact, the possibility of the frequency remains. The earth is still vibrating. The Schumann resonance is still there, beneath the noise of our cell towers and our satellites. The bells are like sleeping giants, waiting for a strike that is tuned to the right harmonic, not a strike of a hammer, but a strike of the mind. Consider the layout of modern cities. The grid system is a direct contrast to the star fort geometry. The grid is designed to dissipate energy, to keep it flowing in straight, manageable lines that can be interrupted and sold. The star fort was designed to concentrate it, to create a vortex of atmospheric charge. When you look at a map of a modern city, you are looking at a circuit board designed for a low power, high control output. The erasure of the star forts, the demolition of their walls to make way for parks, was a strategic military move. They didn't just tear down walls, they broke the circuit. They neutralized the ground. They turned a power plant into a picnic area and called it urban renewal. Not improvement, not growth, something else. A systematic decommissioning of the human battery. We see the symptoms of this decommissioning in our health. The rise of modern diseases coincides exactly with the removal of the bells and the introduction of the wired grid. We are rhythmic beings living in a rhythmic universe, yet we are forced to exist in a state of constant vibrational dissonance. The skepticism of authority that I feel isn't just a psychological trait, it is a physiological response to a world that feels off. The air is heavy because it is no longer ionized, as the water is dead because it no longer flows through the structured stone channels of the old world. We are living in the ruins of a masterpiece, and we have been told that the masterpiece was a mistake. Ask yourself, why does the government regulate low-frequency emissions so strictly? Why are certain vibrational heights restricted for commercial use? If the ether doesn't exist, as modern physics claims, then why is it so heavily guarded? The ether was the medium of the bells. It was the sea in which the old world swam. By denying its existence, the gatekeepers have made it impossible for us to even conceptualize the technology we lost. We are like sailors who have been told the ocean is a myth, even as we sit on the deck of a ship. We look at the bells and see decorations. We look at the cathedrals and see graves. We look at our history and see a long, dark tunnel leading toward a future that never seems to arrive. But the philosophical open loop remains. If the transition was so successful, why are they still afraid of the past? Why the constant need to debunk what should be an obvious absurdity? They are afraid because the resonance is inherent to the earth. You can bury the windows, you can melt the copper, and you can rewrite the books, but you cannot change the frequency of the heart of the world. The bells are gone, but the air still waits for the sound. What if the next reset isn't a disaster, but a return? What if the silence is just the breath before the note? The investigative path leads to a wall of glass, clear yet impenetrable. To see the truth of the bells is to realize that we are currently living in a dream, and the dream is starting to crack. The metallurgy doesn't lie, the geometry doesn't lie. Only the people do, and as I stand in the shadow of a silent spire in a city that forgotten its own name, I have to ask, what will happen when the earth finally rings itself? The institutional memory of the modern world is a sieve designed to catch only the coarse grain of progress while letting the fine, golden sand of the true past slip through. Consider the sheer volume of grand architecture that appeared in the mid-1800s in places where the labour force shouldn't have been able to support it. Australia, South America, the far reaches of Siberia. We are told these structures were built by convicts and colonists using horse-drawn carts and manual pulleys. Look at the stonework. Look at the precision of the joints. Not a chisel mark in sight. Not a mistake in the load distribution. It suggests a prefabricated modular technology that utilized sound to manipulate the density of stone. If you can vibrate a rock at its resonant frequency, it becomes like clay. This is the secret of the Masons, a secret that was literal rather than symbolic. The great work was the manipulation of matter through the etheric medium, and the bells were the primary tools of that manipulation. What if the great migrations of the 19th century were not people seeking opportunity, but refugees fleeing the collapse of the Tartarian energy grid? If the bells stopped ringing, the heating systems failed, the light went out, the very habitability of the northern latitudes would have vanished overnight. This would explain the sudden abandonment of cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow, which were then found and reoccupied by the current dynasties. They didn't build the palaces, they just scraped the mud off the floors and moved in. They found the bells and didn't know how to use them, so they turned them into trophies. They hung them in towers and hit them with hammers, a crude, violent approximation of a delicate science. It is like using a supercomputer as a footstool. Institutional erasure requires a constant, active effort. It is not enough to hide the truth. You must provide a loud, distracting alternative. This is why our museums are filled with primitive artifacts. They want us to believe that our ancestors were obsessed with survival and basic subsistence. But ask yourself, if you were struggling to survive, would you spend 40 years carving a ceiling in a building you couldn't heat? Or was the building the source of the heat? Was the art actually a functional component of a thermal acoustic radiator? The red brick that characterizes the old world style is not just a building material. It is a semiconductor. It is composed of iron oxide and quartz, the same materials used in modern transistors. A city of red brick is, quite literally, a massive integrated circuit. The bells were the oscillators for this circuit. When they were removed or replaced with lower quality alloys, the circuit was broken. The red brick became just brick. The star forts became just ruins. The luminous quality of the atmosphere described in so many early 19th century diaries faded into the grey smog of the coal era. We were told that coal was an advancement. In reality, coal was the fallback technology of a collapsed civilization. It was the dirty, inefficient fuel of the survivors. The transition was presented as a triumph of the industrial spirit, but it was a desperate scramble for power in a world that had lost its connection to the ether. We see the fingerprints of the reset in the way our legal systems are structured. The law of the sea and the maritime admiralty codes that govern modern commerce are based on the idea that everything is a vessel in a liquid environment. Why? Because the world before the reset was a liquid environment, not of water, but of ether. We are still governed by the rules of a medium that we are no longer allowed to acknowledge. The gatekeepers know that the sea is still there, beneath the surface of our sensory perception. They know that the bells were the anchors in that sea by keeping us focused on the dry land of materialist science. They ensure we never try to set sail again. The urban exploration of our own history is a dangerous pursuit. When you begin to look at the bells, not as church property, but as technological hardware, you become a threat to the narrative of scarcity. If the world is a self-sustaining energy system, then the economy is a fraud. If the atmosphere can be tapped with a simple alloy and a specific geometry, then the energy crisis is a fabrication. The skeptics will tell you that the math doesn't work. They will point to the laws of thermodynamics. But those laws were written by the very people who dismantled the old grid. They are not laws of nature. They are the rules of the house. And the house always wins, as long as you play by their rules. Look at the grand organs found in the cathedrals. Some have pipes that are 30 feet tall, capable of producing frequencies that the human ear cannot even perceive. Why build an instrument that produces silence? Because it wasn't for the ear, it was for the architecture. The organ and the bells worked in tandem to create a standing wave that pressurized the air inside the building. This pressure, combined with the piezoelectric properties of the quartz in the stone, generated an electrical charge. This is why saints are often depicted with a halo, a glowing discharge of light around the head. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a physical effect of standing in a high voltage, high frequency environment. The Holy Spirit was a measurable electrical phenomenon. The erasure of this knowledge has left us spiritually and physically malnourished. We are like plants trying to grow under a heat lamp instead of the sun. We are alive, but we are not thriving. The somber tone of our modern age is the result of this vibrational deprivation. We are untuned. We are out of sync with the planet, and the institutions that manage our health and our history have no interest in retuning us. They profit from our dissonance. They feed on our fatigue. The bells, if they were allowed to ring again, would be the end of their dominion. What if the bells were also a form of communication, not just a signal to the next village, but a global, instantaneous network of information transfer through the ether? Long before the telegraph, the Starfort system could have sent a vibrational pulse from Moscow to New York in seconds. The resonance travels faster than sound when it moves through the Earth's crust. It would have been a world of total connectivity without a single satellite or a single cable. A world that was truly unified, not by political globalism, but by a physical, harmonic reality. This is what was stolen from us. This is the forbidden knowledge that the investigative essayist must uncover. As I move deeper into the archives, I find more evidence of institutional gatekeeping in the form of maps that don't match. Maps from 1820 show vast inland seas in Africa and North America that evaporated by 1850. Maps that show the Arctic as a lush green landmass with a central mountain. We are told these were just cartographic errors. But what if they were accurate? What if the reset changed the very geography of the planet? If you can manipulate the resonance of the Earth, you can change its climate, you can change its tides, you can move the water and the mud. The bells were the steering wheel of the world, and we are now a ship adrift, convinced that the rudder never existed. The pattern is clear. The anomaly of the copper plate in Dresden, the global consistency of the star forts, the systematic destruction of the white cities, the orphaning of a generation. It all points to a singular, coordinated effort to downgrade the human experience. Not a slow decline, not a natural decay, a targeted technological assassination of a civilization. And as we stand on the precipice of our own digital reset, we have to ask, are we about to lose the bells of our era too? Is the cloud just another layer of mud being prepared to bury our history? The staccato rhythm of our modern lives prevents us from hearing the deeper melody. We are kept in a state of constant high-speed update so that we never look back at the firmware of our reality. But the firmware is still there. It is written in the stone of the cathedrals. It is cast into the metal of the silent bells. It is waiting. The investigative journey is not about finding something new. It is about remembering something very, very old. It is about peeling back the layers of institutional lies and listening for the hum. Not this history, not that history, something else, a resonance that precedes words and will remain long after the wires have rusted away. I think of the architects of the New World, The ones who signed the orders to melt the bells and fill the lagoons, did they feel a sense of triumph, or did they feel a cold, creeping dread, knowing that they were cutting the cord? To their own source. They built a world of shadow, and they must live in it alongside us. But they have the keys. They have the iridium. They have the knowledge of the frequency. And they spend trillions of dollars every year to make sure we never find our own way back to the tower. Ask yourself, why? What are they so afraid we will hear if the world falls silent enough for the bells to ring? The unresolved philosophical open loop is this. If we were reset once, who is to say we aren't being reset right now? The Internet of Things is a digital mimicry of the etheric network. The smart city is a hollowed out version of the star fort. We are being sold a synthetic version of the reality we once owned for free. We are being asked to applaud our own enslavement to a grid that we used to power with our own songs. The bells are silent, but the vibration remains in our bones. We are the resonance. We are the frequency, and no amount of mud can bury the truth of what we are. The only question is, are we brave enough to strike the bell? The evidence of institutional erasure is most visible in the things they don't explain. Why are the foundations of our oldest buildings made of the same material as the spires? Why is there no basement in a Tartarian structure, but rather a subsurface floor with full-size doors that lead into solid earth? These are not mysteries. They are the scars of a catastrophe that was managed and monetized. The investigators of the future will look back at our time and wonder how we could have been so blind. They will see the towers we used for cell signals and realize they were the same towers our ancestors used for life signals. They will see the pattern. I return to the Dresden fragment. I hold it in my hand and I feel the weight of it. It is not just copper. It is a piece of a world that worked. It is a reminder that civilization is not a linear climb toward the light, but a series of rooms, and we have been locked in the smallest, darkest one. The real purpose of Tartaria's bells was to keep the doors between those rooms open, to keep the light flowing, to keep the humanity connected to the divine through the simple, elegant physics of sound. We are the orphans of that light, wandering through the ruins of a palace we are told is a cave. The rhythm of the script must end, but the investigation does not. Every church you pass, every historical monument you see is a clue. Every time you hear a bell ring and feel that strange, inexplicable shiver, you are touching the edge of the forgotten grid. The gatekeepers can change the books, but they cannot change the soul of the metal. They can silence the bells, but they cannot silence the air. What if the forbidden knowledge isn't a secret held by a cult, but a memory held by the earth itself? What if the only thing keeping the world from waking up is the fear of the sound? Ask yourself, what if? Not this. Not that. Something else. The pattern is global. The erasure is institutional. The resonance is eternal. And, as the final note of this inquiry fades, I invite you to listen to the silence that follows. It is not empty. It is waiting. It is the sound of a world that is about to ring again. And this time, there will be no one left to melt the metal. The investigation is yours now. Look at the towers, look at the mud, look at the bells, and ask yourself, what is the frequency of your own freedom? The institutionalized amnesia of the modern era is not a passive byproduct of time, but a curated state of being. We are taught to look at the massive red brick complexes that populate our mental asylums, our prisons, and our older universities and see Victorian grandeur. We are never taught to see the atmospheric extraction systems built into their very bones. Ask yourself why every one of these buildings, regardless of its supposed function, features a central clock tower that originally lacked a clock. Look at the early blueprints. Those circular apertures were not designed for gears and hands. They were designed for the circular resonance plates of a vibrational harvesting system. The bells were the heart of this system, acting as the bridge between the kinetic energy of the atmosphere and the structural storage of the masonry. When the reset occurred, the new administrators didn't destroy these buildings. They were too valuable for that. Instead, they repurposed them. They installed the clocks to mask the apertures. They turned power plants into prisons and called it a social necessity. What if the Dark Ages were not a period of ignorance, but a period of intentional disconnection? By severing the link between the people and the frequency of the bells, the architects of the current paradigm created a population that was physically weaker and more easily managed. We see this reflected in the contrast of scale. Look at the doors of the old world, 10, 15, 20 feet high. We are told this was for grandeur or ventilation, a technicality that collapses under the weight of logic. You do not build a 20-foot door for a 6-foot man in a world where heating is a struggle. You build it because the inhabitants were different, or because the door was part of a larger acoustic chamber designed to move air at a specific velocity. The erasure trope is most effective when it makes the truth seem like an impracticality. They want you to think the old world was wasteful, so you don't realize it was infinite. The metallurgy of the bells was the first thing to be standardized by the rising institutional gatekeepers. By the mid-19th century, a series of ordinances began to appear across Europe and the Americas, regulating the specific composition of bronze used in public castings. This was not a matter of quality control, it was a matter of vibrational suppression. By removing the noble metals, the iridium, the silver, the trace amounts of gold, they ensured that the bells could no longer couple with the etheric field. The new bells were dead. They made noise, but they did not create resonance. They were effectively silenced even as they rang. This is why the music of the modern world feels so hollow compared to the descriptions of celestial harmonies found in ancient texts. We are listening to the echoes of a broken instrument. Consider the Great Exhibition of 1851 in London, the Crystal Palace, a structure made of iron and glass, so vast it enclosed full-grown elm trees. We are told it was a temporary marvel of British engineering, but look at the design. It is a greenhouse on a planetary scale. It is a giant conductive cage. What if the Crystal Palace was not an exhibition hall, but a demonstration of the atmospheric energy that had already been mastered? And what if the fire that destroyed it years later was not an accident, but a decommissioning? Anything that proved the existence of the old grid had to be removed. The white cities of the world's fairs were not models of the future. They were the funeral pyres of the past. They allowed the public one last look at the glory of the Tartarian tech before it was bulldozed and replaced with the modern world of wires and wood. The rhythmic sentence structure of history is being rewritten to exclude the most important beat. We are living in the offbeat, the dissonant space between the true pulses of the earth. The sombre atmosphere of our current cities is not a result of urban stress, but of vibrational starvation. We are surrounded by stone and metal that is no longer singing. The bells are still there in the background of our cultural consciousness, but they have been reduced to symbols of tradition. Ask yourself, when did tradition become a synonym for obsolete? It happened at the exact moment the bells were disconnected from the grid. Institutional erasure is a recursive process. It requires each generation to be slightly more ignorant than the last. By the time we reach the 20th century, the memory of the resonance has been relegated to the realm of fairy tales and weird science. The scientists who tried to rediscover it, like Nikola Tesla, were systematically marginalized and their papers seized. Tesla was not inventing something new. He was attempting to reconstruct the Tartarian bell network. His Wardenclyffe Tower was nothing more than a modern steel version of a cathedral spire. He understood that the earth is a giant bell, and if you know how to strike it, you can provide power to the entire world. Not this power, not that power, something else. The tension of our investigation lies in the realization that the evidence is not hidden in a secret vault, it is hidden in plain sight. It is the load distribution of our history that is off. We are told that humanity moved from primitive to advanced in a straight line, but the architecture tells a different story. It tells of a peak that occurred centuries ago, followed by a managed decline. The bells were the pinnacle of that peak. They were the interface between the human mind and the planetary body. To understand the real purpose of Tartaria's bells is to understand that we are not the masters of our technology. We are the scavengers of a superior one. If you look at the six star forts of the Netherlands or the Vauban fortifications of France, notice the water. They are always surrounded by complex canal systems. Official history calls them moats, but water is a conductor. Water is a memory bank for vibrational frequencies. The Star Fort was a giant liquid state battery, and the bell at its center was the trigger. When the bell rang, the vibration travelled through the stone into the water, creating a standing wave that could be projected for miles. This wasn't a defense against cannons, it was a defense against entropy. It was a way to keep the environment structured, healthy, and energized. The institutional gatekeepers turned these into forts to justify their presence in a world they had just conquered. The staccato pulse of the investigation leads us to the orphans again. If you were a child in 1880, being told that the magnificent stone city you lived in was built by your grandfather, but you could see that the doors didn't fit and the bells didn't ring, what would you think? You would eventually stop thinking. You would accept the narrative because the alternative, that your entire reality was a lie, was too terrifying to contemplate. This is the unsettling truth of our existence. We are the descendants of those who stopped asking questions. We are the inheritors of the silence, but the silence is starting to crack. As our modern wired grid begins to fail, as the inefficiency of our energy systems becomes undeniable, the forbidden knowledge of the bells is resurfacing. People are starting to notice the mud flood windows. They are starting to notice the spectrographic anomalies in the old bronze. They are starting to ask, what if? What if the history we were taught is just a cover story for a global heist? What if the Frew's real purpose of Tartaria's bells was to keep us free, and their removal was the first step in our incarceration? The pseudo-academic language used by the experts to dismiss these theories is a form of linguistic gatekeeping. They use words like pseudo-history and conspiracy theory to create a barrier between the observer and the observation. But you don't need a PhD to see that a building is buried in 6 feet of mud. You don't need a degree in metallurgy to see that an old bell is made of a more complex alloy than a new one. All you need is the willingness to look at the anomaly and refuse to look away. The investigative essayist is not a creator of truth, but a restorer of sight. The pattern-based investigation always ends at the same wall, the wall of erasure. Every time we find a piece of the puzzle, We find that the piece next to it has been intentionally destroyed, and the libraries burned, the bells melted, the maps corrected. It is a global pattern of institutional arson, but they can't burn the resonance. They can't melt the frequency. The bells of Tartaria are not just physical objects. They are a mathematical certainty. They are the inevitable result of a civilization that understands the laws of the ether. And as long as the laws of the ether remain, the technology can be rebuilt. Ask yourself why the elite are so obsessed with acoustics in their private halls. Why do they spend millions on concert halls that mimic the geometry of the old cathedrals? They know the power of the vibration. They just don't want you to have it. They want you to listen to the compressed and digitized noise of the modern world, while they sit in the pure resonance of the old world's ghosts. It is a contrast of scale that is almost too cruel to acknowledge. They are living the white city while we are living in the mud. The philosophical open loop remains unresolved because the reset is still in progress. We are not looking at a finished event. We are looking at an ongoing suppression. The real purpose of Tartaria's bells was to provide a foundation for a reality that didn't require authority, a reality that was self-tuning and self-sustaining. By removing the bells, the gatekeepers created a hole in reality that they then filled with themselves. They became the intermediaries between us and the source. They became the attuned ones in a world of the untuned. As I stand before the massive, silent bell in the square of a city that has forgotten its own history, I realize that the investigation is a circle. We begin with a small anomaly, a copper plate, a buried window, and we end with a global realization. The world is not what we are told. The real purpose of Tartaria's bells was to act as the heartbeat of a living world. Without them, the world is on life support, and the gatekeepers are the ones holding the plug. The erasure of the Tartarian energy grid required the physical dismantling of its most visible components, but the intellectual dismantling was far more insidious. We must look at the technical schools that proliferated in the 1890s. These were not institutions of discovery, they were institutions of redaction. They took the unified field theories of the old world, the science of the bells, and fractured them into discrete, manageable subjects. Physics was separated from acoustics, chemistry was separated from metallurgy, spirituality was separated from math. By compartmentalizing knowledge, they ensured that no single mind could reconstruct the grand mechanism. Ask yourself, why is the most important component of our reality, the ether, no longer part of the standard curriculum? It was removed not because it was disproven, but because it was the medium through which the bells operated. Without the ether, the bells are just heavy metal. With it, they are the keys to the kingdom. What if the great reset of the 19th century utilized the bells themselves as the primary weapon of destruction? If you can create a frequency that stabilizes, you can also create a frequency that shatters. This is the dark side of the resonance. The institutional gatekeepers may have discovered how to invert the harmonic of the star forts, turning a healing grid into a seismic detonator. This would explain the mud flood as a deliberate liquefaction of the soil, a vibrational pulse that turned solid ground into a slurry of clay and sediment. The survivors were then rescued by the very people who had triggered the collapse. It is the ultimate problem-reaction-solution gambit. They broke the world so they could sell us the glue. Look at the load distribution of our current electrical grid. It is incredibly fragile, prone to cascading failures, and requires constant, expensive maintenance. Contrast this with the Tartarian spire and bell system, which had functioned for centuries with almost no overhead. The transition was not an upgrade, it was a downgrade designed to enforce a pay-to-play model of existence. The bells were the open source hardware of the old world. Anyone with the right alloy and the right geometry could tap into the power. This radical autonomy was intolerable to the rising banking dynasties. They needed a system that could be switched off from a central location. They needed the meter, they needed the bill, and so the bells had to go. The pseudo-academic dismissal of Tartaria often centres on the lack of written records. But ask yourself, who writes the records? The winners. The erasure trope is not just about burning books. It is about rewriting the definitions of the words within them. They renamed the Tartarian Empire as Mongol hordes or unsettled territory. They renamed the power stations as cathedrals. They renamed the resonators as bells. By the time the third generation of orphans reached adulthood, the original purpose of the towers was not just forgotten, it was linguistically impossible to describe. We lost the vocabulary of our own greatness. Consider the technical terms of the old world that still linger in our language, stripped of their context, tuning in good vibrations, resonating with an idea. These are not metaphors. They are the linguistic fossils of a time when we understood that our consciousness was directly linked to the planetary frequency. The real purpose of Tartaria's bells was to keep humanity in tune. When the bells were removed, we went out of tune. The result is the modern condition, a state of perpetual sarkic dissonance, a sombre, grey existence where we are constantly searching for a connection that was once as ubiquitous as the air. We see the institutional gatekeeping in the way archaeological sites are managed. Why are the lower levels of the Great Pyramids or the cathedrals of Europe restricted to the public? Why is the official dating of these structures always so much younger than the geological evidence suggests? They are protecting the timeline. If the timeline breaks, the narrative of primitive to advanced breaks with it. If we realise that we are a regressed civilization, the authority of the current system vanishes. The bells are the proof of that regression. Every time a renovation project replaces an old bronze bell with a modern steel one, another piece of the truth is melted down. The investigative path now leads us to the contrast of scale in our modern technology. We have perfected the micro, the chip, the sensor, the pixel, but we have completely lost the macro, the architectural energy system, the planetary resonator. We are like a civilization that has learned to build perfect watches but has forgotten that the sun exists. The bells were the macro tech. They were the interface between the human scale and the celestial scale. By destroying them, the gatekeepers confined us to the micro. They gave us the smartphone to keep us from looking at the smart spire. What if the unsettling feeling we get in certain old buildings is not the presence of ghosts, but the presence of residual resonance? The stone remembers the frequency. The iron ley lines in the walls are still waiting for the charge. The tense atmosphere of an abandoned cathedral is the tension of an incomplete circuit. It is a silent scream for the bell that is no longer there. The forbidden knowledge is the realization that we are living in a haunted house, and the ghosts are the frequencies of our own potential. Institutional erasure is never 100% effective. There are always anomalies. the bell that wouldn't melt, the map that was hidden in a chimney, the grandmother who remembered that lights without fire. These fragments are the seeds of the revisionist documentary. They are the pattern that refuses to be smoothed over. And as we move into the sixth part of our investigation, the pattern is no longer just historical, it is prophetic. The real purpose of Tartaria's bells was not just to power the past, but to safeguard the future. A world that can be tuned is a world that cannot be controlled. Ask yourself, why are the elite so focused on Mars and space when the earth under our feet is still full of buried palaces? It is a distraction. They want us looking up and away so we don't look down and in. The bells are under the mud. The power is in the resonance of the soil. The Tartarian legacy is not on another planet. It is the very ground you are standing on. But to see it, you have to be willing to look at see the buried windows and admit that the world didn't start in 1945. The staccato rhythm of our investigation is the heartbeat of the truth, trying to break through the somber layers of the lie. Each part of the script is a strike on the bell of our collective memory. Not this, not that, something else. A resonance that is getting louder with every question we ask. The real purpose of Tartaria's bells is finally coming into focus, and it is more provocative than we ever imagined. It wasn't just energy, it wasn't just light, it was the very etheric fabric of our freedom, and it's time we rang it again. The institutional gatekeepers have long relied on the contrast of scale to make the truth appear impossible. They point to the sheer size of the Tartarian bells and the gargantuan weight of the cathedral stones, asking us to believe that such things could only be the result of backbreaking primitive labour. It is a psychological trap. Ask yourself, if you had mastered the frequency of the earth, would weight even exist? The real purpose of Tartaria's bells was the manipulation of gravity itself. We see the evidence in the floating architecture of the old world, structures that seem to defy the very laws of load distribution. These were not built by lifting stones, they were built by singing them into place. The bells were the conductors of a levitational symphony that allowed for the construction of cities we cannot even replicate with modern cranes. This is the ultimate forbidden knowledge, that matter is not solid, but a density of vibration. If you control the vibration, you control the matter. The erasure trope was deployed to turn this science into magic and superstition, effectively removing it from the realm of serious inquiry. We are taught that anti-gravity is a science fiction dream, yet we stand in the shadows of cathedrals that were built using that very principle. The sombre atmosphere of the modern city is the result of a world that has become heavy again. We are literal prisoners of gravity because we have lost the bells that once lightened our load. Look at the technical terms once more: heavy-hearted, light-headed, weighted down. These are the echoes of a physiological reality. When the resonance was active, the human body was lighter, more energetic, and more resilient. The reset didn't just bury our buildings, it buried our potential. We became slaves to the earth in a way our ancestors never were. The institutional erasure of Tartaria was the implementation of a global heavy gravity protocol. They traded the bells for the ball and chain of the materialist economy. Not this, not that, something else, a systematic reduction of the human frequency. As we move into the final stages of our investigation, the pattern becomes a mirror. We are looking at the ruins of Tartaria and seeing the ghost of what we could be. The unresolved philosophical open loop is no longer about the past. It is about our willingness to reclaim the ether. The bells are waiting in the silence. The copper is still conductive. The geometry is still perfect. The only thing missing is the strike. Ask yourself, what if the sound that it ends? This world is the same sound that begins the next. What if the real purpose of Tartaria's bells was to remind us that we were never meant to be grounded?